Hello, everybody. You are listening to Through Time and Clades. Once again, first time in a while. But in any case, I'm Albert.
And I'm Joan.
Right. So yeah, we kind of took a break back there, didn't we?
Yeah, just a little one.
Yeah. It wasn't fully intentional. We did plan to take most, if not all, of May off after we recorded the huge episode released on defunct paleontology websites. But it wasn't exactly planned for us to take a break for this long. However, we are back, and as usual, we have a news episode for you. And because we took such a long break, this episode is going to cover news from the past 3 months and not just the past single month or so. So that'll be interesting. It'll be pretty jam packed with content. But before we jump in, how have things been with you over this long break?
Things have been fairly well. Yeah, like this was sort of an unexpected kind of departure from the show, but I think given what we've been up to, um, it was a good break. Kind of help us clear our heads and kind of think about what we want to do moving forward with the show. Um, but I've been very good. I've been catching up with a lot of reading and work, helping out the folks at home. The progress on our house has been moving at a very swift pace. And I know I keep saying like we're getting there, we're getting towards construction, but now I can say like we actually have something to show for. We have the foundation set, and the floors are being put in, and I believe by next week, from the time of recording, uh, we're going to start having the framing and everything, and it's going to really start to move forward from there. So fingers crossed we still are able to have our house by the end of the year like we had originally planned,
Hmm.
at least around Thanksgiving time. So that way, we can decorate it and have a good time. Um, my goodness, yeah, there's been so much pop culture stuff that I've been keeping up with that I wouldn't even have time to go through a lot of
Yeah.
it. I'll just say I've been seeing a lot of the big budget movies that have been coming out, and a lot of great paleo media that we will allude to in a little bit. And I've just been impressed at the the pace of discoveries that we've been getting lately.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
in fact, just in this week, I mean, there's been so many amazing finds.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, with the launch of the James Webb Space Telescope back in December, finally, as of this week, we're able to get our first images from the telescope. And I'm sure a lot of you have probably seen these photos, but my goodness, they are beautiful. And I know the crew of the telescope team have been discussing that the telescope has been going beyond their expectations in terms of the quality of the imagery. If you compare with like the Hubble Space Telescope, which had been in operation since the 90s, that was like the gold standard for a lot of astronomy, photography, and research in cosmology. And with this is like the next step from that.
Mm-hmm.
It almost kind of makes Hubble photos seem like Polaroid cameras in terms of the quality of some of the images. But really, like the main one of the main goals of this telescope is to study the origins of the universe and deep cosmology, going back to the Big Bang. And with Hubble, the size of the telescope was able to reach photos as old as within 500 million years of the Big Bang. But with this new James Webb telescope, we're going to be getting within 200 million years of the
Mm-hmm.
Big Bang. So that is right in that sweet spot that cosmologists have determined was the time when the first stars and galaxies were forming. And given the powerful spectroscopy that this telescope can do, we're going to be getting so many details from that period of time that we'll really be able to understand, just what is like the early story of our universe.
Mm-hmm.
And I, for one, cannot wait. Um, Definitely been looking forward to that. Um, but that's enough about on my end. Albert, I understand you've been doing some pretty fun things as well these past few months.
Yeah, I suppose you could say that. Yeah, I'm not going to belabor the point too much because Obviously, three months is quite a long time, and a lot has happened. So just sitting here and recalling all those things, I think it's not going to be all that interesting. Um, but yeah, it's had its ups and downs, and I've been working on quite a lot of different things over that period. Even though we haven't been releasing new episodes, I have been, as I've been promising, doing what I can for the website. And progress is slow, but I managed to squeeze a fair bit of work on that into that period. Scientific research that I'm doing is still going. Various other personal projects are going. So yeah, no, I've been quite busy. You could say over the past 3 months. But I'm glad to be back and working on this. And yeah, things have been quite exciting in the realm of science in terms of like things that I'm not personally working on, but just other people are presenting in the last week. It's been really good for fossil bird paleontology. Lots of really exciting new specimens and studies have come out recently. So I'm very, very excited to incorporate a lot of that into the eventual updates special, the next update special for Dinosaurs, the second chapter, whenever that happens. We haven't decided, but it presumably will at some point. And yeah, lots of stuff that I'll be ready to share then.
Well, excellent. So
Yeah.
I understand that you have a special comic that you wanted to share with us today.
Oh, yeah, I guess so. This is something of a follow up to something we discussed in our previous episode, the one on defunct paleontology websites. And since that was a few months ago, you may or may not actually recall this because this actually wasn't really something we focused on necessarily in the episode. But if you have a good memory, or if you watched that episode recently, um, close to the end, I mentioned how there was this biology webcomic I used to read that I really enjoyed, and how there's essentially no trace of it left on the internet anymore. Um, but I was able to get in touch with the artist of the comic, and so on the next page, I will share the particular comic strip that had that I felt was particularly memorable of this webcomic because I managed to get permission from the artist to share the comic on the show. And so here it is. So as of the time of recording, to my knowledge, there is basically nowhere else on the internet where you can actually get, where you can actually see this comic. So it's a sort of exclusive content because even Wayback Machine, if you try and go back to the old website it was on, it doesn't preserve any of the images, which is unfortunate. But it turns out the artist had kept those comics on their hard drive, and so they were able to share with me this particular one that I said I especially liked. And I guess just in case anyone can't read the words very well on the screen, I'll read it out for you here. So in the first panel, so one person is saying, "You know that evolution picture with the fish coming out of the water and turning into people? Why does it have to be so vertebrate centric? Like, can't we do it with isopods or something?" And then we get the middle panel showing the evolution of isopods from aquatic to terrestrial forms, and you can see that they haven't changed that much during this transition. And so the other person is like, and the first guy is like, "Yeah, okay, that was stupid. Never mind." And yeah, I really loved this comic when I first saw it. And even now, I think it's perhaps one of my favorite biology comics ever because it is true. Like, we are very vertebrate centric when we think about evolution. And in some ways that is understandable, in other ways it is something we need to be careful about when we think about the diversity of life and its history. And while it is true that the transition of, say, isopods onto land is not nearly as dramatic in terms of the types of changes that are involved compared to the terrestrialization of our own lineage, the vertebrates, I think this is still a pretty illustrative example. It's still very good as a teaching moment because it turns out that arthropods did not have to change as much as we did in order to come onto land. They were, in a way, kind of pre-adapted to this kind of lifestyle, and that is very interesting to think about the reasons for that and what kind of effect that had on the history of life. It's kind of like in that old video that we have talked about. So it's an old video that used to play at the previous version of the Smithsonian's paleontology hall. There was a video featuring a cartoon Eurypterid, basically a group also known as the sea scorpions, even though they weren't really scorpions. And there was this famous explorer Eurypterid named Arthur Pod, because get it, arthropod. And he was reporting what he was seeing on the on land, which is a really fascinating thing for the animals of the time. Hardly anyone had been on land at that point. And he talks about how, he, as an arthropod, he has all these adaptations that worked well in the water, but also happened to be very useful to allow him to kind of survive on land for much longer than some of the other creatures then might have. Yeah, it's a fun video. Sadly, it is no longer in the new version of the Paleo Hall, from what I understand. But we have talked about it on the show before. People have like recorded it and put it on YouTube, so we can share a link in the video description. But yeah, so unfortunately, there are these like kind of two pieces of lost media in a way that talk about the terrestrialization of arthropods and compare it to vertebrates that aren't around anymore. But thanks to the generosity of the artist Jamie Canepa here, I can share this comic with you with the world once again. And so really nice.
Yeah, and we're definitely all glad for that. I mean, it's just a fascinating story too. How arthropods have colonized the land. I mean, not once like vertebrates,
Right.
but like multiple times across different lineages.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's just a neat story. I mean, we've talked about it a couple times on this show, particularly regarding chelicerates. That's the arachnids in their kind,
Right.
um, and the myriapods, the centipedes and millipedes.
Mm-hmm.
And there's always there's still many questions about those transitions, but yeah, definitely not as many great bodily modifications as vertebrates have had to go through. And of course that's a very well known story. Of course, I'm also reminded, I feel like I've talked about this before on here, but there's a cartoonist, Larry Gunyik,
Oh
who
yeah.
did a 5-part history of the world in a graphic novel form, which is very fun and very wacky. And he had a famous panel in there with these two lobe-fin fishes that
Right.
are the famous walking onto the land, and it's like, oh, we're the first ones on land, and then the other one's like, oh, but the bugs are already here, and then the other one's like, yeah, well, they won't get the credit because my descendants will write the book.
Right.
And then they just need to step on all the bugs, and it's a whole thing. Um,
Yeah, that's a classic. Yeah.
oh yeah, I'm sure that panel in particular is probably around somewhere, and
Oh yeah.
if we're able to find it, we'll share it too,
Mm-hmm.
because that's a classic. Fantastic. Yeah, I'm glad that you're able to kind of re-preserve this comic for everyone to see. Because I definitely agree with what you've been saying about it. Um, Now, in regards to the paleosphere, um, these last couple of months have been very lucrative in that department
Yeah.
in terms of like really great paleo media. In that case, involving television documentaries and YouTube shows, among other things. So if we jump to the next slide, we figured it would probably be good to just kind of give a little bit of our thoughts on these shows. Now, of course, these are not going to be extensive reviews by any means, just kind of our general impressions, our likes and dislikes, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. Because obviously, if you want to know more about the programs that we're about to talk about, at least in some cases, there's certainly going to be plenty of blogs and Twitter threads and things that you can check out. Um, so, of course, the big one that we had alluded to, and a bunch of people have been gushing about, is Apple TV Plus's Prehistoric Planet,
Mm-hmm.
which was a 5-part documentary that was hosted by David Attenborough and features probably some of the best reconstructions of of late Cretaceous dinosaurs and their kind that we've seen in recent years. And what was neat about this particular series, as you might kind of guess from the title, it's sort of a play on the great, we call it like the Planet franchise
Mm.
of the BBC. Because this was like a BBC uh, production as well. So if you think about Planet Earth or the Blue Planet or the Green Planet, of course, this kind of takes that format and just uses it on prehistoric animals. So it's sort of like a spiritual successor to, say, Walking with Dinosaurs, where you have naturalistic environments like live action backgrounds for the most part, and you have CGI creatures that are put in there, and they're rendered so as if they are actually like living among that environment, and you get to see sorts of plausible behaviors that have been heavily informed by the fossil record. In particular, what was neat about this show was that a lot of the consultant work was done by a good friend of ours, Dr. Darren Naish. Um, and he had co-written a book with two other authors, John Conway and Memo Kozman, called All Yesterdays, which was sort of informing our understanding of prehistoric animals by like using the fossils as close as we can, but also kind of using inspiration from living wildlife to kind of get a sense of these as fully fleshed out organisms, and the fact that there are maybe behaviors or display features that would likely never be preserved in the fossil record, but could be absolutely plausible, in animals that were very similar to creatures alive today. And so many of the illustrations that were made for that book and some of the proposals and hypotheses that were made had like almost directly carried over
Mm.
into Prehistoric Planet. And so some people have affectionately called this the adaptation of All Yesterdays,
Right, right.
in a sense, at least for the late Cretaceous creatures,
Yeah.
because, well, technically, so the all of the animals in Prehistoric Planet lived within a window of time known as the Maastrichtian Age. So if you remember back in our lecture series, Humanity a Prologue, and Dinosaurs a Second Chapter, you have the geologic time scale that is subdivided further and further into various points based on the geologic record. And so you have like the eons and the eras and the periods and the epochs. And so the epochs are made up of different ages. So the Maastrichtian is the very last age of the not only the Cretaceous period but the whole Mesozoic era. So this is right about like kind of like the last hurrah for the Mesozoic dinosaurs and the pterosaurs and the marine reptiles and all that great menagerie of creatures, which kind of works to its advantage because it gives a very strong impression that the worlds of the past were just as rich and diverse as the worlds of today. We think about global surveys of wildlife in the present day. Whether it's the tropical rainforests of Brazil or the East African savannas or the Eurasian steppe or the coral reefs in Australia. There's just so much out there. And that was very much the same for the Maastrichtian age and all the other times in prehistory. And so, of course, since we had kind of announced that this documentary was coming forward, all the episodes have since aired on Apple TV Plus. I'm pretty sure most of our friends had gotten our Apple TV Plus subscriptions. They had like a week long free trial,
Yep. Mm.
and I know some of us like kept it for a little bit longer. I know I did because I wanted to kind of see what the service was about. But I wanted to watch it on the big TV and see it there and share it with my family. And we were very impressed. I mean, I was certainly very pleased, and I was just in awe of the imagery. I mean, my goodness, there are so many sequences that we could talk about over and over. Um, but I think we'll save those for another time and for other reviews. But I think, as far as I can say, um, I did not have very many complaints regarding this series. I thought the CGI was very impressive for what they were able to do. It'll certainly age well in the coming years compared to something like Walking with Dinosaurs, which had a sort of a television budget. But even back then was kind of cutting edge. But like compared to this now, these animals have never looked so good. Um, Everything from the great Tyrannosaurus all the way to the small dromaeosaurs. They looked like real plausible animals, and they moved like real plausible animals, and they had like an essence to them, where it's as if like you're going birding and you see a bird just kind of chirping around doing its thing.
Yeah.
It kind of has like a what's a good word for it? Not like a glassy stare, but like kind of like a very well, like how like humans and some other animals can make like very discrete facial expressions,
Mm.
and they're very expressive. And some other animals like lack those facial muscles, and they can kind of they have very basic movements to their I guess cranial anatomy. Um, I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but they were able to kind of get that essence in these animals as well, especially since most of them are stem birds technically.
Mm.
So I was just very impressed with that. I thought the landscape choices and the regions were very interesting. They had a lot of very obscure animals that they put on screen. Like this is not just the stock dinosaur hour where it's T-Rex and Triceratops for 50 minutes at a time. There's a lot of like recently discovered species, relatively obscure species that will certainly increase in popularity as more and more people look them up after watching the show. Like I know for a fact one of the animals, which actually appears in the eye of the little advert for the show here, that's a Babarodactylus. It's a pterosaur. It had a long crest on its head.
Mm.
Um, I think one of our friends like did a check on Google, and like the search results for that species just jumped through like the airing of that episode, which is good. That's something that we hope is happening when people tune into shows like this. Like their curiosity is piqued and they want to learn more about this amazing world that we once lived in. Um, so yeah, I was definitely very impressed with Prehistoric Planet. Albert, what are some of your thoughts?
Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely don't want to do a deep dive and make this a whole thing because we'd be here forever. But very brief thoughts. Like yeah, like this is the series that those of us who are interested in like paleo documentary series or like portrayals of extinct life as living animals have really been wanting and waiting for all of these years, and this just like hits and it ticks basically all the right boxes. Um, and if you're interested at all in seeing in visualizing how extinct animals might have looked and behaved in life, like you have to see this. Basically, it really is amazing. And I have already written a review basically on my blogs of the series, so that's one of the reasons why I won't belabor the point here, because you can just go and read that and see what I thought of it. But one thing I will highlight, and this kind of relates to what you were just saying about bringing obscure taxa to public attention, is that I really, really loved that they had a segment about Mononicus, which is an alvarezsaur. And if you are a longtime listener, you know that alvarezsaurs are some of my favorite animals ever. My online avatar is an alvarezsaur. And the Mononicus segment is just amazing, I have to say. Like, I was very impressed because almost everything they showed regarding Mononicus in the show is based in some way on something we actually know about alvarezsaurs. Like, there are some segments in this series that are more speculative than others. In some cases, it's basically, let's give an example. Like, there's a segment where they show a troodontid dinosaur deliberately spreading fires around to kind of flush out its prey. And that's something that is that has been observed in modern animals, specifically some kinds of birds of prey in Australia will actually do this. They'll pick up burning sticks and like drop it on vegetation and use that as a way to like expose prey items. But there really isn't much reason to think Troodontids did this. Like, yeah, there's also nothing against it. Like, it's a perfectly plausible behavior. Like, they were probably reasonably intelligent animals, very versatile hunters, and we know they hunted small animals, and we know a lot of modern theropods, a lot of modern predatory birds will use fires, not necessarily deliberately spreading them, but like they will hang around fires to catch the animals that are fleeing from them. So it's certainly there's certainly nothing that demonstrates that Troodontids couldn't have done this, but it is like a pretty clear case of like, oh, let's take this interesting behavior from a living animal and just fit it onto an extinct one that happens to resemble them in some way, which is fine, and it's really cool because it highlights an actual behavior that exists in modern animals, and it shows that potentially these behaviors could have existed in extinct ones too. But with the modern Icus segment, like like I said, almost everything is not just like based on them fitting a modern species onto an extinct one. Like almost everything they show it doing, and the way they designed it, almost everything is actually based on things we either know or reasonably think allosaurs had or did. Um, I know one of the things that has really kind of ground people's gears. One of the very few things I would say has ground some people's gears about the Mononicus segment is how its design looks very much like a barn owl in terms of the coloration and the way that they gave it a sort of facial disc of feathers around its head. But even that is actually inspired by things we know about allosaurs. Essentially, there was a really recent study, which we actually covered on our show, that showed that allosaurs have an extremely sensitive hearing. Like the structure of their inner ear is actually very similar to that of owls. And so perhaps they were using their hearing to detect prey. And it is possible that a facial disc would have helped with that. Now, I will grant the facial disc itself is speculative. So we don't know if we had that, if they had that or not. And there perhaps might be good reasons to think maybe they didn't necessarily because the shape of their skull is actually pretty different from that of an owl. So maybe they didn't need one. But even so, like it's an obvious nod to actual scientific research. And I would say that might well have been like the most speculative thing about the Mononicus. Like almost everything else is like based on even harder evidence than that. Like with obvious exceptions like the color or things like that. But in any case, yeah, no, I loved the Mononicus segment, and what I loved even more, I think, is that just about everybody else loved it too. Like I was looking at reactions on Twitter soon after I watched the episodes, and like so many people, like even people who aren't necessarily already like super into paleontology like we are, we're talking about the Mononicus, saying like, "Oh my goodness! Like I love this dinosaur. It's my new favorite dinosaur. Like it's so cute." And like before this, let me tell you, like before this, nobody would have known what an allosaur was. Like, or almost nobody who wasn't like a paleo nerd. Which is interesting because allosaurs have featured in paleo documentaries before. The Mononicus was actually in Chased by Dinosaurs, hosted by Nigel Marvin. The Discovery series, Dinosaur Planet, had a couple of different species of allosaurs. But the thing was, like those in those series, allosaurs didn't really play like a sort of focal part. They weren't like main protagonists, and those series did not really show anything about allosaurs that made them interesting, to be honest. Even though we actually already knew in some ways about how weird they were even back then. But yeah, this series really highlights like how weird allosaurs were and what they might have been doing with their really weird features. And I really, really appreciate it for that. And yeah, so like allosaurs are a sort of, at least Mononicus, is a sort of B-lister now in popular culture in terms of Mesozoic dinosaurs, and I just love it. I what did I say? Like I couldn't be happier about that. It's just amazing that this one series just made everybody fall in love with Albersaurs, and that's wonderful. I think they deserve it. Yeah, I might as well mention here that our friend Ilari, who is an artist, um, he has suggested that the Mononicus in Prehistoric Planet should be nicknamed Dolores after the character from Encanto, which I also appreciate a lot because, well, first of all, the reason he suggests that was because Dolores has the power of super hearing, which of course the Alvarezsaur has a super sensitive hearing, so there are parallels. But of course, she is also my favorite character in the movie Encanto, which I mentioned in our review of it. So yeah, no, I definitely like that a lot, and I hope it takes off. That being said, I know Darren Naish has already commented that within the crew that worked on the series, they had their own nickname for many of the creatures in the show, including the Mononicus. But for most part, they haven't really revealed what those nicknames are. So I guess us fans are kind of free to come up with our own for now. But yeah, no. That was definitely a highlight of the series among many. I really love it, but if you really want to hear more of my detailed thoughts, including some of my few minor criticisms I have of this show, you should just go and read my review on my blog, which we will link in the description. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think what's nice is that clearly the higher ups have been paying attention to the hype for Prehistoric Planet, and it seems that has kind of given maybe some potential rumors that maybe this is not the last time we'll be exploring the Prehistoric Planet. Especially since the BBC has apparently opened up a new division devoted to like CGI, CGI documentaries, and so who knows? Maybe we'll get other ages and epochs and eras that get the Prehistoric Planet treatment.
Right.
I'm sure we would all be very grateful for that. And what's interesting is that the crew behind the show is still kind of in that grace period where they're not really supposed to reveal a whole lot about like the making and production and some of the decisions behind the show, which is interesting. So I'm wondering what they're kind of saving up for. So
right, yeah. That is quite curious, isn't it? And yeah, they have said that if the series does well, then there is a real chance they could be making more. But you're right too that there's quite a bit about the behind the scenes material that they haven't really revealed. There's been a little bit, like there have been some interviews and some short videos that show some of the work that has been done for the production, but we know there has to be so much more than that. So yeah, I wonder what they're waiting for.
Absolutely, and hopefully we'll get an announcement that a companion book will air alongside this.
Right.
As there's always been a companion book for all of these BBC shows.
That's true.
Even the more obscure ones, which is, hey, fingers crossed that we'll get to see some more of that in the future. Now, in terms of BBC, like other BBC documentaries that we've had, we also had the release of Dinosaurs: The Final Day / Dinosaur Apocalypse for all you Americans in the audience. This was a smaller special than Prehistoric Planet that kind of focused on, well, not kind of, that focused on the end Cretaceous mass extinction event, particularly at the Tanis site in North America. And this was also another David Attenborough kind of production in a sense, in that he narrates and hosts, and he features throughout. Actually, a lot more than Prehistoric Planet. So this is kind of more like his smaller releases, like Attenborough meets the giant elephant or something like that. And I thought that this was a particularly fun one too. Clearly, like the CGI reconstructions were not like the main goal of this particular series. This was sort of like kind of exploring the paleontology done in the region. That is kind of also controversial in many ways that I'm sure we've talked about before. But it was a very interesting series in that it really kind of gives you a sort of play-by-play of how life could have responded to certainly like a very tragic day in Earth's history. So like we start out with like reviewing the paleontological site and like some of the evidence that's been found of the different animals and plants and like what their conditions were like. And then they've kind of worked backward to kind of give an idea of like, okay, so time one is when the bolide hits the Earth, and what sorts of things were going on in the environment and in the atmosphere, like what we could expect for a region that was relatively far away from the Chicxulub impact site in the Yucatan. And as you can imagine, it was very harrowing, very depressing. Um, this is usually always kind of a standard for these sorts of documentaries, or even parts of
Mm.
documentaries. Goodness knows there's been so many dinosaur documentaries where you spend most of your time enjoying the beauty and diversity of this group of animals, only to watch them all horribly die in the end with terrible catastrophe. And so, of course, we have a documentary that just focuses on that part,
Mm.
um, which is always a bummer, but it really kind of scores. It kind of brings home, just how almost miraculous it was that anything survived that to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we are literally the descendants of survivors of an apocalyptic
Yep. Mm.
apocalyptic event, many apocalyptic
Several,
events.
yeah.
And so that's always kind of humbling to think about. And of course, David Attenborough is always a delight to see on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
He gets so tickled pink whenever he gets to see cool fossils and cool data, and he's just astonished, like, "Wow, this is incredible stuff!" And that's the enthusiasm that we all love,
Mm-hmm.
and we can certainly like feel that um, from him. We can feel that energy from him. Now, before I pass it over to you, Albert, I will clarify that there was two releases of this special. So the BBC got it first, as they usually do, and it was just treated as like one standalone special. So from start to finish, it was about like an hour that they spent on the special. Um, but in America, PBS got it, and they made it into a two-part Nova special.
Mm-hmm.
And so they spent the first part with more of the paleontological stuff that I was talking about, and then the second part was devoted more to the reconstruction of the mass extinction event. And so so that made it a 2 hour special. So like, okay, well, how do you get 2 hours out of 1 hour? Well, they had many interviews with a multitude of paleontologists,
Mm-hmm.
many diverse paleontologists in the field that were interspersed within the documentary to kind of give their inputs and elaborations on aspects of paleontology and the late Cretaceous world and some of the animals that we're living in. And honestly, this is kind of a rare thing for me to notice, but I thought that particular version was much better
Mm-hmm.
than the BBC one, especially since they also kind of fixed some of the errors and a little bit more of the controversial stuff
Mm-hmm.
in the BBC one. So, of course, one of the things about Tanis that's so controversial to begin with is that oftentimes, like the field crews, um, make claims about some of the fossils that they found, and they're pretty amazing claims. But this is usually before the peer review process and the publication process is
Right.
taken. So they're kind of like these extraordinary claims that have not been looked at by others to see whether they actually are extraordinary, or if this is just sort of like wishful thinking, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe a trick of the eye, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Mm.
So they were able to clarify a lot of those aspects of that in the PBS version, as well as some outright strange models for some of the animals. This is a very minor thing, but they had an animal called Thessallosaurus. It's a particular favorite of mine. Small bipedal dinosaur. Uh, Sometimes it's an ornithopod, sometimes it's not.
Mm-hmm.
The classification is kind of tricky there. But it's an herbivore, a small herbivore, well, small-ish
Yeah.
herbivore.
Mm.
And in this, in the BBC series, they had it essentially like an otter, where it, it would like walk around on land and stuff, but then if it was attacked by like a tyrannosaurus, for example, it would just run into the water and hide, where I guess the T-Rex can't get to it. Um, yeah, I don't know of very many other paleontologists that have seriously proposed something like that, at least not since like the 1940s, when that was typical of like hadrosaurs, for example. Where they really hammed in the duck-bill-ness of the
Right.
duck-bill dinosaurs. But in the PBS version, they just removed that whole sequence altogether. So yeah, a couple things like that, a couple changes that they made, and honestly, it was a lot more engaging, and I think um, a lot more paleontologically accurate in that way. They removed some of the sensationalism while still keeping it like a very impactful
Mhm.
documentary. And so I was very pleased to see that version, as well as the original version. We did a live stream, I think, where we watched it. Um, now, Albert, I believe you haven't watched this one yet. Is that correct?
No, yeah, I haven't really. Um, yeah, I'll admit, like I was not as excited about this one as I was for Prehistoric Planet. Like you mentioned, the animal models, at least some of them look don't look nearly as good. Some of them are outright inaccurate. Um, and there are indeed, as you alluded to, certain professional and scientific controversies about the Tanis site. Um, that dampens my enthusiasm a little bit regarding like press for it. But it sounds to me like the the additions that the PBS airing made really were were really to its benefit, and made it a very good documentary. So yeah, maybe at some point I'll watch it. But yeah, not especially high on the priority list at the moment for me.
Oh yeah, totally fair. And of course, like there are certainly plenty of other areas where one could go if they wanted to learn more about this extinction event. Of course, Riley Black has just published
Yes.
what I am understanding is a very amazing and emotional book, The Last Days of the Dinosaurs. That is definitely on my to read list. I have like 50 books on that list already,
Yeah.
so I'll get to it at some point.
Right.
I'm planning on saving up my fetch points so I can get a discount so I can go buy it and read it that way. Um, so like there's definitely that. And so kind of like shifting base a little bit, not necessarily a documentary, but we had the final episode of Dead Sound's wonderful The Dinosauria series. In this case, this was The Last Tyrant. And yeah, kind of echoing a lot from The Last Days of the
Yeah.
Dinosaurs in that you get a representation of the late Cretaceous mass extinction event. Um, but what was particularly neat, and at least I certainly thought about this particular episode, this final episode, because this is closing out the whole series,
Yep.
um, is that it's definitely a kind of a swan song to the dinosaurs. You watch this extinction event. Well, even like of course you get the before, right? Like the minutes before, where all these animals are just being animals, chilling out, eating and loving and all this stuff. And then of course the comet hits, and then it's just catastrophe. And then all the animals slowly succumb to their injuries and to the amazing heat that came like within hours after the impact. But then it kind of shifts in time, and we are brought back to a museum where, of course, all the great skeletons are on display and all these different fossils. And we see like movie posters and toys and all this stuff. And of course, lots of birds flying around. And it's really sort of like kind of a reassurance that, yeah, it was a tragic day and, the Mesozoic is long gone, but the dinosaurs are still very much with us in multiple ways. And we have certainly not forgotten their legacy in the slightest. I mean, people know about dinosaurs more than they know some animals alive today.
Yeah.
So
Right.
we've certainly done them a great service, and I don't know. I kind of liked that angle. That sort of like I thought it was a great way to kind of bring everything together, because really like it ends with like clips from previous episodes
Yep.
interspersed with like fossils that inspired those sequences. It's like, oh, you're meeting some old friends for the last time. Um, and I don't know. I really thought that was a nice little bow on this series that has, in terms of totality, has been wonderful. I mean, it's always great to see animated dinosaurs that especially look really good.
Yep.
Obviously, Dead Sound has put his time and effort into making these animals as best as they can, even like up to the minute where he's tweaking the designs to match the science, and um, it's just nice. So I'm definitely looking forward to like starting from the beginning and just doing like a marathon which one could easily do,
Yeah.
um, because there were only about, was it 5 or 6 episodes?
I forget. Uh,
Hmm. But they were only about like 5 or 6 minutes each,
right.
so
Yeah. Mm.
that's easily like maybe a half hour, if that, of your time could be spent marathoning. You get just a nice, sweet little series celebrating dinosaurs,
Mm-hmm.
which is
Mm.
essentially what it
Yep.
is.
Mm.
And so I was definitely pleased. What do you think, Albert?
Oh yeah. Like, whew, it really is a masterful example of storytelling and like essentially visual storytelling because this is a series that doesn't really have a narrator accompanying it or at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the main focus is all on the visuals. Um, and no, it's like you said, it's incredible the kind of the way it pays tribute to to the Mesozoic dinosaurs. It's quite incredible, that's for sure. Um, so I definitely enjoyed it a lot. And the thing you mentioned about how the creator is like working up to the minute, like updating the designs of the animals. Um, like there was definitely one particular change he made that stuck out to me relative to scenes from this episode that had been presented in the original trailer that came out last year for the whole series. And we actually mentioned this on the show back when the trailer came out, I think. Um, so in a few shots in the trailer, there are some birds that show up. Not modern birds, but like extinct birds that lived during the Mesozoic. And in the trailer, they look essentially like songbirds, like modern songbirds, which is not really accurate because songbirds were almost certainly not around during the Mesozoic. Um, and we also mentioned this, but the creator, I think, realized that shortly soon afterward, because in an interview he did with the Love in the Time of Chasmosaurs podcast, he mentioned that, and he said, "Oh yeah, like people pointed out that the songbirds shouldn't really be there." Um, so in this version of the episode, the final product, he actually changed the design of the birds to be based on Enantiornithians, which are the so-called opposite birds, a group of an extinct group of bird-like dinosaurs that went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, unlike the lineage that led to modern birds. Um, so then they're not based on any real species that was found in the time and place that the episode is centered around, but they are based on like other species that are known from more complete remains, and so in that sense they are now more time accurate and no longer anachronistic songbirds flying around. So yeah, I thought it was really cool that he went to the trouble of actually changing that. Um, and as with all the episodes, he actually has a sort of behind the scenes companion video to this that sheds a lot of light into the kind of creative process behind the episode, which is, as always, well worth the watch. Um, I would say one small thing that I found kind of strange in the episode. I am not an expert on the end Cretaceous extinction. Like I do work on things that are sort of adjacent to it, like the effects of the extinction on birds, for example, or like why certain groups survived and others didn't. But I'm not so much an expert on like the physical effects of what would happen if the asteroid hit here or things like that. However, uh, one thing that did strike me as strange was the fact that in the aftermath of the asteroid impact, we saw like some of the dinosaurs in the same place. Some of them were seemed to have like basically died instantaneously, and others were still kind of up and running. Um, and that felt weird to me. That yeah, like two animals around the same size and essentially the same spot would be affected so differently by such a major global event. It seemed more likely that basically everything in the same spot, if they were exposed to the impact, would just die right then and there. You wouldn't have this aftermath where some of the survivors still straggling around, at least not in the same location, and kind of looking at the dead bodies of their compatriots. But I get it. Like, I and again, I'm not 100% sure how plausible that is, but I get it. Like that is for artistic and storytelling reasons that those scenes were there. So I think regardless of the actual plausibility, like it did get its emotions across pretty effectively, or the intended emotional impact at least. Um, and yeah, those are probably my main thoughts about that final episode. One last thing I think I'll mention is that all of the works that we are highlighting on the slide here take place at or near the end of the Cretaceous in the Maastrichtian, as you mentioned regarding prehistoric planet. Um, and certainly two of them focus on like the actual extinction itself, but prehistoric planet made a very deliberate decision not to do that in the series. So
Mhm.
there is no scene in prehistoric planet where we see the asteroid hit and then everything die. Nothing of that sort happens. It's more just these are some days in the life in the Maastrichtian. Like it's yeah, there is no impending doom or anything going on there. So if you are tired of like popular media like constantly focusing on the end Cretaceous extinction when they show the Maastrichtian, well, again, that's another point in favor of prehistoric planet. But no, I really love that final Dinosauria episode from Dead Sound. Again, I haven't seen the Dinosaurs the Final Day. But I have heard some good things about it, like from you and others. Um, so yeah, all these works, I think, if you're interested in Mesozoic paleontology, would seem like pretty fantastic things to check out.
Absolutely. And kind of alluding to what we talked about a little bit regarding like the possible future of prehistoric planet, we definitely know for sure that we are still in for some great paleo content coming forward. Um, just recently, it was announced that we have two landmark series that are going to be released in different platforms in the near future. So there was one that's going to be launching on Paramount. I think it was Channel 5 is what they called it,
Yeah,
but it'll probably
right.
end up on Paramount Plus at some point. Um, it's a dinosaur series, a 4-episode dinosaur series, narrated by Stephen Fry, famous actor, comedian, which sounds really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And what's actually really funny is like this is not Stephen Fry's first forte into dinosaurs. This is kind of like a fun little story that I have. Uh, when I was younger, I really wanted an iPad, and
Yeah.
so when I got that as a gift for a birthday, one of the very first apps I got was this dinosaur app that was completely narrated by Stephen Fry, and it had a lot of like CG models that you could turn around and stuff, and he would talk about the different dinosaurs. So it's kind of fun to see him like he's back and he's talking about dinosaurs, but they're actually gonna probably look a lot better than the animals did on that app. It's like that's that one artist who passed away. He did a lot of stock art of many different prehistoric animals, and they've kind of made have a second life of their own, just showing up everywhere, while still being like fairly good quality too, which is kind of funny for something like this. Like the dinosaurs that he had designed like were fairly good for what they could have been. So there's that. Then NBC is doing another series, an 8-episode series called Surviving Earth. Now, I know this is being spearheaded by Tim Haynes, who you might recognize if you're fans of the Walking With franchise, because like he was the producer and like the kind of like the creative head behind that entire franchise. So he's back, and it's looking like Surviving Earth is going to cover various mass extinction events and how different organisms have responded to those. And we'll also get, like the world of those organisms as well across those episodes. And that sounds really fun. It certainly is giving me nostalgic vibes for Animal Armageddon,
Hmm.
which was an Animal Planet show that also had like very, well, I'd say um, very iffy CG, but nonetheless covered a very similar topic, and it was surprisingly comprehensive for what it was going for. Um, so I guess this might be like the modern successor to that, if you like to think so. Um, so yeah, we're getting two like big budget paleo documentaries coming forward, and those are going to be fun.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, just as a small aside, next week, as of this episode's premiere, we're also going to get the finale for Camp Cretaceous. So all you Jurassic World fans out there, we get the final season. Um, and for me at least, like I'm interested in like the like what I'm interested in the main characters mostly.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what's going to happen to them and their journey. We're also getting Primal season 2, and that looks insane. And I am really excited for that. I never thought I'd see the day where there is a show with a dinosaur and a caveman doing battles with Celts and Babylonians and fire demons and just all kinds of crazy stuff. um, so definitely looking forward to that, and I may or may not give my thoughts on those going forward. Especially regarding Primal, I have no idea what their schedule is going
Mm-hmm.
to be, because that first season, well, the first half of that first season, they did like an episode a night, so they just kind of ran through it, and then we had a very long delay. So I don't know if we're going to get sort of the same thing
Mm-hmm.
with this. We will see, but I'm sure it's going to be fantastic. So yeah, basically, long story short, as this slide and the upcoming documentaries we've talked about are indicating, it's a pretty good time to be a paleo fan.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's certainly safe to say. But all right. I think it's a good opportunity now that we jump into our news stories
Mm-hmm.
that we picked for this episode.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Now, we're doing something slightly different this time because we're covering 3 months. In the interest of space and time, we figured it would be better if each of us covered at least one story per month. So instead of our usual format where we have like two stories per month between the two of us, where Albert does two and I do two, we just picked three stories from the past 3 months that were of particular interest to us, and we've just kind of gone from there. And so we're going to go in sort of a chronological order from that time to kind of help just catch up our news stories a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So we picked some good ones, and we're excited to kind of share those with you all. So let's go ahead and jump into the next slide. And
Yep.
I
Mm-hmm.
believe I have the first story. All right. So my April study focuses on the dingo, which I like to think of as the Watson of the genus Canis.
Ha.
Because honestly, for many years, this animal has remained a bit of an enigma in the world of mammal evolution. I mean, it's clearly a dog, but it goes much further than that. You know, while a great many strides have been made in our understanding of the origin and development of the dingo, there is still much controversy in that understanding. If you recall from episode 9 of Humanity: A Prologue, there has been some debate about about where in the dog family tree the dingo branched off, and thus who its closest relatives actually are. Previous studies have recovered differing results. For example, a Friedman et al.'s 2014 genomic study found that the dingo was a side branch to the domestic dog lineage, while Zhang et al.'s 2020 genomic study found a place for the dingo within the domestic dog lineage. They allied it with breeds from Eastern Asia, particularly in the southeast. And the latter is particularly interesting, considering that the New Guinea singing dog has been allied with the dingo in numerous studies, as well as the fact that there appears to be a population of dingo like dogs residing in Thailand and neighboring countries.
Mm-hmm.
But so far, there has been no consensus on which of these conflicting models is the most accurate, and that is mainly down to the type of data used in them. So many of these studies have the genome of a boxer, the type of mastiff, as their base domestic dog sample, but it has become apparent that the sequence from these dogs is full of thousands of genetic gaps. And it also tends to skew towards a low chromosomal divergence. And so that'll tend to affect the data in ways that are maybe not reflective of the actual evolutionary relationships. So, for this study, Matt A. Field and colleagues decided to sequence the very first high quality de novo genome of a dingo of the Australian desert variety. So there's no signs of admixture with domestic dogs. And to use that for their phylogenetic sequencing. And so a de novo genome is basically a sequence that was derived from scratch. So it's without any aid from a related genome to kind of help align the genes all together. And so they then compared this with five other previously sequenced de novo genomes from a handful of domestic dogs that span all of the major breed types. So they had a Basenji, which is a Central African dog
Mhm.
and one of the oldest recognized breeds. They had a German Shepherd, a Labrador Retriever, a Boxer, and a Great Dane. And they also used the de novo genome of a Greenland wolf, which is a population of the Arctic wolf that has not faced any significant interbreeding with other wolf subspecies or with domestic dogs. And of course, because that can ensure even less tampering of the data. And lastly, they really wanted to hone in on any details they could find regarding overall health to see if whatever evolutionary divergences they found impacted the data in any meaningful way, using the German Shepherd as their frame of reference. And so the resulting phylogeny seen here on the left seems to support the side branch model. So the dingo belongs to an early diverging lineage closely allied with other domestic dogs, with the Greenland wolf representing an outgroup. And so, one key difference between the dingo and the other dogs came down to an aspect of their chromosomes, where there was a complex inversion or a rearrangement with chromosome number 16. And it was also found that dingoes lack the expanded pancreatic amylase gene that is seen in other dogs. The amylase is a protein enzyme that helps break down glucose. It's become well known, of course, that domestic dogs underwent significant evolutionary change during Neolithic times, as different breeds were brought into agricultural communities and then consistently fed a high diet of starchy and fatty crop foods.
Mhm.
Many humans have undergone that transition as well. And it appears that whoever the dingo's ancestors were, they did not descend from farming societies, but likely came instead from mainly hunter gatherer societies. And that makes things extremely interesting as, again, we still lack any good archaeological evidence of which people brought the dingo to Australia.
Mhm.
But the timing makes it highly unlikely that the first Aboriginal Australians had done so. So it had to have been one of the coastal communities that sailed and settled in the islands of Southeast Asia within the last 8,500 years or so. These distinctions in dingo health do make a lot of sense considering their history within Australia itself. Dingoes appear to have undergone a sort of genetic bottleneck upon their arrival on the continent, which means that they have had to develop their own genetic diversity since that time, allowing for unique changes. Wildlife and ethnographic studies also testify to the fact that a great part of the dingo's diet is marsupials and reptiles, which has caused natural selection towards those types of foods. To have such an expanded amylase gene would not have been beneficial towards a mainly carnivorous diet. And dingoes are currently one of the apex predators of Australia, which explains the fact that dingoes also have very high cholesterol levels compared with other dogs,
Mhm.
which may be an adaptation against infections. So, this is an important study that has opened up some intriguing possibilities, but there are still many unanswered questions remaining. For one, we really do need to clarify that the dingo's apparent early divergence isn't an artifact of a lack of data.
Mhm.
It would be really vital to acquire de novo genomes from other dogs, especially the New Guinea singing dog,
Yep.
to see if these relationships are still accurate. And because there's always a possibility that some other type of ancient domestic dog breed may have diverged even earlier than the dingo. The Greenland sled dog, for example, is one such possible breed because it also has a small amylase gene like the dingo. And certainly ancient DNA from dogs would be especially helpful. That's always fun. And so hopefully such studies are on the way. And so that's my first paper.
Mhm.
Albert, do you have any additional thoughts?
Not too much, but I mean, I have not. very closely followed the dingo controversy, but I am aware of it and of how enigmatic this problem is in understanding dog origins. So this seems like a very good step forward indeed.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm certainly excited too. Um, yeah, definitely the archaeological controversy is really fascinating to me because then that'll also highlight interesting human history
Mm-hmm.
that
Yep.
may have
Mm.
been lost in the historical record. 'Cause, yeah, we talked a little bit about this in Humanity, a Prologue, but Australia has an interesting history regarding human occupation
Yep.
because between about 60 to 50,000 years ago, once humans settle in Australia and in Papua New Guinea, of course, when everything was Sahul to begin with, um, there does not really appear to have been any other populations of people that have settled there, and so there's a lot of questions about you know who may have brought the dingo to Australia because again the timing doesn't match at all. Um, it probably wasn't the Austronesian speaking peoples, the great shipbuilders that colonized and settled in the Pacific. Um, and there's still a lot of mystery and mysterious populations in and around Southeast Asia that have been uncovered with ancient DNA, looking in the archaeological record, that suggests that there was a lot more going on there between the time of the first Australians and the time of the Pacific expansion that we're only just now learning about.
Mm-hmm.
And so the dingo is going to play a really big part in trying to unravel those mysteries. So, yeah, we'll see how that goes for sure. Um, all right. I believe, Albert, we have your next paper,
Yep.
which is also an April study.
Yep. Sounds good. We do indeed. So this is a very broad scale study, but it's certainly quite an interesting one. Um, so this study is based on the observation that diet is highly correlated with body size in many vertebrate communities and many groups of vertebrates. It seems so. You might have noticed this as well, if even if you have only a basic knowledge about animals. Essentially, this is the observation that herbivorous animals, animals that eat mostly plants, and carnivorous animals, in this context, meaning animals that primarily eat vertebrates, um, tend to reach larger sizes than omnivores, animals that eat both, or invertivores, so animals that eat mostly invertebrates. And this is a pretty well-known pattern. It has been called like a sort of what's it been called? A U-shaped distribution, essentially, and you can kind of see that on the graph here. So the carnivores and the herbivores kind of form the peaks of the U, whereas other feeding strategies kind of fall in the dip in between. And so what this study did was I wanted to see how true this pattern was across a large diversity of vertebrates. So they tallied up, they gathered a lot of data on the diets and the body size of many different kinds of vertebrates, including not only mammals, but also birds and non bird reptiles, and even marine fishes. And something really interesting that they found was that this pattern holds for almost all of these different groups. It holds for land mammals, for birds, for non-bird reptiles, and for marine fishes. Now, there were a few exceptions to this, however. So the main exceptions that they identified were marine mammals and marine birds. So that's pretty interesting. All right, so I guess the question that arises from that is, okay, so why is this pattern so common? And so they provide some suggestions here in the graph. And so this graph here is showing the size distribution of land mammals of different types of ecologies. And next to the graph, you can see along the dotted lines, they have suggested some possible limitations that have been proposed before regarding what kind of factors limit the sizes of animals depending on what they eat. So, for example, it is quite possible that herbivores tend to get much bigger than other types of animals because they feed on, at least a lot of the time, on very low quality types of diets. A lot of vegetation is very fibrous, there isn't a lot of nutrition in any one mouthful, and so it is actually often very advantageous for herbivores to grow to large sizes. And the reason for this is that, well, first of all, this allows them to travel further in search of their low quality food, so they can cover more ground more easily. And additionally, that means they can also eat more of that food in the first place, so they can eat enough of it to actually get enough nutrients out of their diet to live off of such low quality browse. And furthermore, not only are they able to eat larger absolute amounts of food, but being bigger also means they can grow longer guts to process those very fibrous vegetation. And that's certainly also very helpful for an herbivore. So there are many clear advantages to being large if you're an herbivore, as long as there's enough food around. And because of the requirement to have longer guts, that also means like the small body size limitation on herbivores is going to be higher than it is for many other groups, at least animals with other types of diets, because you're gonna need to, you can't get too small to fit the guts that you need to digest plants. Whereas carnivores, on the other hand, well, one reason they probably get big is probably to hunt those large herbivores, because you have to be of a certain size to be able to take one of those down. And so probably the increase in body size in herbivores also drives sort of coevolution in getting like these large predators roaming around. But they probably can't get quite as big as herbivores can. And the main reason for that is probably there are these trade-offs, like the energy you expend to hunt versus how much meat you get at the end of a hunt. There's a limitation to that because apex predators, of course, sit at the top of a food chain. And as you might have learned in high school, or if you read a lot of books about ecology, this energy is lost at each level of the food chain. So there's only a certain amount of energy, only about 10% of energy at each level that organisms can actually incorporate to fuel themselves and as their own kind of build their own bodies. And so if you're sitting way at the top of the food chain, that means a lot of energy beneath you on the lower levels of the food chain have already been lost to the environment, and that means you can't, that's not available to you, and so that probably puts a cap on how big you can get for being a carnivore to be profitable. Whereas a lower body size limit probably also has to do with like how big you need to be to take down your prey. Now, it is true that many carnivores can take down prey larger than themselves, and certainly at very small body sizes, that's perhaps especially true. Like a weasel, like one of the smallest carnivorous mammals around today, can take down things like rats and rabbits that are much bigger than they are. However, they still have to be of a certain size in the first place to be able to have the power needed to take down another vertebrate, to be able to bite through the flesh and bone, or inflict enough damage to kill something of that size. So they still have to be of a certain size, and that probably puts a lower body size limit on the carnivores. What about the omnivores and invertivores? Well, there's a pretty clear limitation on invertivore body size, and that's because the things they eat tend to be really small. They're eating insects, and insects are really good food for their size. Like they are packed with protein. So if you're a small animal feeding on a diet of insects, it's not too bad of a strategy. You can get lots of bang for your buck by eating insects. But you can't get too big, because once you're of a certain body size, you probably can't find enough insects to eat to be able to sustain those larger body sizes. And certainly it is probably not a coincidence that the largest primarily insectivorous mammals that are around today, like the aardvark and the giant anteater, they feed on social insects that exists in very high concentrations. So things like ants and termites, and all of them are living in one big nest or mound, and so you can go around and eat a lot of these insects at once. And so that's kind of how they manage to get around that to an extent. But yeah, even then, there's only a certain you reach a certain point where you get too big to survive on a diet of just terrestrial invertebrates. So that puts a limitation there. And omnivores, of course, you would think have a pretty good deal. They can eat just about anything. Certainly, us humans tend to enjoy the benefit of that quite a bit. But this also means you're also in the sort of jack of all trades and master of none situation, right? Omnivores are not nearly as specialized as herbivores to feed on low quality diets of low quality vegetation. And so that means even though they can eat some vegetation, they don't want to spend all of their time doing that. It would be much more profitable for them to find higher energy food sources. So think things like fruits or seeds or nuts. And on the meatier side of their diet, they might want to spend quite a bit of time hunting for prey as well, because meat is a pretty nutritious kind of food source. And so that means that they're gonna be spending a lot of time looking for high energy food sources that may not be that abundant or concentrated in one spot. And so that's going to put a limit on their body size because they can't spend all their time eating low quality food like a lot of the large herbivores can. And so that's probably the main limitation on omnivore large body sizes. And so those factors together pretty nicely explain this kind of U-shaped distribution that we see in the diet size structure of vertebrates. And so what about those exceptions, the marine mammals and birds? Well, that probably has to do with both the environment that they live in and the types of food sources that are available. So the main way in which marine mammals and birds deviate from this size trend is that it is not the large herbivores that are the biggest marine mammals, but instead invertebrates. So think, of course, the blue whale, which is larger than pretty much any other animal that's ever existed. And it feeds mostly on plankton, not on plants. And this highlights something, and that is the fact that in the marine realm, there are places where you can get huge concentrations of invertebrates, huge concentrations of protein, and that means in the marine realm you can take advantage of that, and invertebrates can grow bigger than a lot of the other kind of ecological categories. And whereas in marine birds, there isn't a huge amount of difference between all these different groups. Now, there aren't really any herbivorous marine birds, but in the marine realm, it doesn't really matter if you're an omnivorous, invertebrate, or carnivorous bird. They all kind of roughly spread around the same size. And so it is likely that the main limitation for marine mammals and birds in terms of their body size is less to do with their diet, and more just kind of factors that relate to being an air-breathing animal in an aquatic environment. So, for example, larger-bodied air breathers are able to dive deeper because they can hold the breath for longer, and also find it more efficient to be able to sink down to deeper depths. And probably factors like that influence their body size more than the kind of diet does. And so, yeah, and not to mention in the marine realm, you also have looser constraints on your large body size as well, because the water kind of buoys you up, and so you can, all other things being equal, you can often grow a lot bigger than animals can on land. So that was pretty interesting that you see, other than marine mammals and birds, you see a very consistent kind of body size distribution related to diet across all types of vertebrates. But also, what these authors did was they looked back in time too. They looked to the fossil record to see how long this pattern has been around. Now, they didn't do this for every group of the vertebrates that they looked at. They mainly did this for mammals. And in part, that's probably because mammals have a better studied and more complete fossil record. But in any case, what they found was that looking in the fossil record, it seems that this pattern has been established perhaps ever since the Cretaceous, if not before that. So, like, for most of the time that mammals have been around, we already see this pattern where the herbivores and carnivores get bigger than omnivores and invertebrates. And this is the case even though in the Cretaceous, the largest mammals were not very big compared to modern standards. The largest mammals in the Cretaceous were around the size of a badger, maybe the size of a wolverine or so. Not that big in the grand scheme of things. But even then, if you look at the relative sizes, the carnivorous Cretaceous mammals and herbivorous Cretaceous mammals are still the biggest mammals around. And this has held true certainly since the beginning of the Cenozoic era, after the end Cretaceous extinction. And so, yeah, this size distribution has been around for a long time. And I would be really interested to see a study like this done on other, fossil groups. Like, what about the Mesozoic dinosaurs? That seems like a good case study to look at for this kind of thing. And at a glance, just thinking about, dinosaur sizes, I suspect that we're probably going to see something very similar to this. Certainly the largest dinosaurs ever are primarily herbivorous species. And it seems that the largest carnivores, though not as big as the largest herbivores, seem to have gone bigger than the omnivores and invertivores. So yeah, I think we would find something interesting there if we looked at other fossil groups as well. However, even though this pattern has been very consistent over time and across groups, the authors also add a word of caution in their study, and that is that recent and future extinctions are very likely to disrupt this pattern. And you can kind of see this already in the graph. So you can see that at the top of many of these bars, there's a section, a white box, showing size ranges of these groups that are represent species that are now extinct. So if it weren't for the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions, we would have like even larger herbivores and even larger carnivores around today, for example. But because they went extinct in the last several thousand years, that kind of skews the size distribution a little bit. And of course, we are still in the middle of a biodiversity crisis now, and so it's quite likely that in the future we will be seeing more extinctions from many of these groups, and near the top of these size distributions as well, because large animals are often very vulnerable to major environmental changes. And on the next slide, they have a sort of visual representation of this. So something else they did in their study is they looked at the extinction risk of animals that are around today. And then they ran these simulations based on the extinction risk of these animals to see how likely these species are to go extinct in the next several centuries or so. And then so they ran these simulations many times, and then got these graphs that you see on the top here. And what this shows is the change in the median body mass of each of these categories in the next few centuries, or the predicted outcome, like based on like which species go extinct. And so what they found is that large herbivores in particular are very likely to undergo a median size decrease in the next few centuries if the vulnerable species that are around today, if most of them go extinct. So that is kind of alarming because, well, for a couple reasons. Well, first of all is that we're not entirely sure how this is going to impact the rest of the ecosystems around the world, because again, this pattern has been consistent among land mammals at least for over 100 million years basically. And so what's going to happen when you disrupt this kind of size distribution pattern? Well, we don't know, and kind of unpredictable ecosystem effects are not really good, and it's probably, and the effects are very likely going to be negative, because these are actually very conservative estimates for when and what species are going to go extinct, because the simulations that they ran only consider the species in isolation. Like, okay, they're at risk of extinction now, and so they're likely to go extinct in the next however many years if they're not conserved. But what this doesn't take into account is the effects of certain extinctions on other species. So, for example, if we have all these large herbivores dying out, that's almost certainly going to impact the large carnivores as well. And they're, species that rely on those large herbivores are also likely to go extinct or at least decline. And that's not something that these simulations take into account. So these are conservative estimates of extinction rate. It is quite likely that if we were able to model all these complex factors, which might not be practical to do at the moment, we would see like even more dramatic decreases in body size over time in the near future. And so, as a sort of visual representation of these extinctions and kind of distribution of body size, they have this illustration on the bottom in the paper. And so, what this is showing is that you can see the very large animals that are very pale colored are species that died out during the Pleistocene megafaunal extinction. So we had things like the Columbian mammoth that was much larger than any elephant alive today, and the giant ground sloths, which were much bigger certainly than any of the modern sloths around today, and even larger than many of the mega herbivores that are alive nowadays, but went extinct during the Pleistocene. You had things like gigantic armadillos and giant bears that all died out during then. So these pale-colored animals are all sort of examples of that. And then you have kind of an intermediate shading, not quite dark, but not quite as pale as the Pleistocene forms. You have species that are alive today but are very likely to go extinct in the next few centuries if drastic action is not taken. So things like rhinos, pangolins, tigers, and some of the other big cats. And in the omnivore category, they show a sun bear. Also, I might as well mention the Pleistocene extinction. The example they give for the omnivores is a large skunk that actually went extinct during the Pleistocene. But yeah, the omnivores have been not quite as badly hit as some of these other diet categories, and that probably relates to how versatile they are in terms of their diets. And then finally, they have in dark shading large species that are alive today and are likely to continue surviving for the next few centuries. So they have a muskox for the herbivores, a baboon for the omnivores, an aardvark for the invertivores, and a hyena for the carnivores, a spotted hyena to be exact. And so, yeah, so there might well still be some large mammals around in the next few centuries, but the overall size is likely going to decrease if we don't take steps to conserve our large-bodied fauna that is around today. And finally, they also give examples of small-bodied forms for each of these categories. So we have, a mouse, a shrew, another kind of shrew, and a marsupial, a carnivorous marsupial. And so it turns out that in small body size categories, yes, there are certainly small-bodied mammals alive today that are in severe threat of extinction. But in terms of like the overall like change in body size that these extinctions will have, there's probably not going to be so much of an effect of small-bodied animal extinctions in terms of like changing the minimum body size of each of these categories. So at least on that front, small-bodied, the lower body size limitation is likely to remain pretty stable. But the trouble is with the big ones. So yeah, a really fascinating study that covers a lot of ground and looks at a lot of different aspects of this one phenomenon, and also gives us something to think about for the future as well. Do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, I thought it was a very fascinating paper. I'm very curious as to how they were able to calculate for some of the more specific species that they covered here. I'm curious that they have the musk ox as like a potential survivor,
Right, yeah.
considering that the Arctic isn't exactly doing so hot right now. um, but wow, yeah, I am very curious for Mesozoic dinosaurs, especially,
Right.
and for other vertebrate groups, because yeah, I would tend to agree with you that it would probably match very closely. I mean, certainly for the herbivorous dinosaurs. I mean, we have a whole group of dinosaurs, the sauropods, that are just they're known for their massive sizes, so
Yeah.
they'll probably help make the U a little bit ewer
Right.
in
Right.
terms of visualization. Um, I gotta be completely honest. I was today years old when I learned that the word invertivore existed.
Yeah. Yeah, we tend to say insectivore, but of course, strictly speaking, that's restricted to insects, right? So, yeah, I guess they decided to use invertivore as a more inclusive kind of term.
Yeah, I actually really appreciate that because I guess I haven't bothered to look, but I mean, I've been kind of wondering for years, like if there's a more alternative term to use. So I'll definitely keep an eye on that one. Invertivore. All right. Well, excellent. Um, it's kind of nice, like kind of piggybacking off of this paper in terms of like megafaunal extinctions. I have my May paper on the next slide,
Mhm.
where I decided to do something a little bit different for a change, because this is technically not a full paper,
Mm.
but a comment on a previous study that we had talked about on our 2021 roundup episode. That being Jacob Dembitzer et al. From December 2021. So these were the later December stories that we talked about in that episode, not the year in review kind of thing that we had done.
Mm.
Um, and if you all might recall, in that paper, the authors recorded a survey of hominin kill sites in the Levant between 1.5 million years ago to 10,500 years ago, and found that the body mass of the different vertebrate species declined in size over time. From the earliest times, hominins seem to have been targeting the largest megafauna species, like elephants and hippos, over time targeting smaller and smaller species until most of the sites are concentrated on things like deer, gazelle, and tortoises. Simultaneously, it appeared that the overall abundance of the different species was in decline as well. And these two observations, it was argued, pointed to earlier non Homo sapiens hominins effectively kicking off the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions, gradually shaping the development of stone tool industries as smaller species were being targeted. And I mean, that was certainly a fascinating paper and one with interesting implications,
Mm.
as it was adding further possible evidence that the knack for anthropogenic environmental changes began long before the origin of our own species and
Mm.
our spread across the continents. And in regions where it is generally understood that megafaunal species fared a better chance of survival from extinction through their long term interactions with humans, things like Africa and India. And so that's where this response paper comes in. So the authors, we have Meir Orbach, Linda Amos, and Reuven Yeshurun of the Zinman Institute of Archaeology in Israel, commented and commended Dembitzer et al.'s data collection process, but had some concerns, some pretty major concerns with two key themes from their paper. And so, for my May story, this is essentially an update to an earlier thing that we had discussed, which is always good. Science marches on. So, their first point regards the assumption that human species will almost always target the largest species of game during hunting expeditions.
Mm.
Because the Dembitzer et al. Paper only looked at large to medium sized mammals and reptiles, there is always going to be this gap in information about any other species that human hunters would be going after, like birds or aquatic animals. But regarding the paper's mostly mammalian kill list, there did appear to be a trend that hunters were always seeking out the biggest prey, which suggested to them that this was a near universal trend in early human societies. For the test if that was the case, the response authors simply looked at other regions of the world at contemporaneous points in time, just to be sure. And they did not find that trend. For example, around the eastern Mediterranean, between 250 to 30,000 years ago, kill sites actually show that smaller mammalian species like gazelles were being seeked out the most. And the larger mammal species, in contrast, were more likely to be targeted not by humans, but by hyenas, which lived in the region during that time. And this suggested that it was more cost effective for humans to go after gazelles and similar sized game, especially as this part of the world often sported open, unforested lands that made hunting expeditions less risky and more conducive. And this is certainly seen in the rise of stone projectile technologies right after 250,000 years ago, which made that type of hunting easier for humans. So it isn't always the case that humans sought out the biggest megafauna first. Environmental conditions and competition with predatory mammals tends to influence what game are selected. And their second point concerns a more general critique seen in archaeology, and that's the assumption that any one region of the world, with a large sampling of sites, in these case archaeozoological sites, will accurately reflect the long term trends of those regions. In this case, that the data acquired by Dembitzer et al. Truly shows the gradual decline in megafaunal size and numbers across an over million year time span. Now, this is certainly understandable. Our knowledge of a place and point in time will only be as good as the sites we have for it.
Hmm.
And some areas are a lot better known than others. In the case here, the response authors argue that kill sites do not reflect the abundance of prey species in the Levant so much as they reflect the hunter's long term prey choices.
Hmm.
That is to say, the kill sites will be biased towards which species of game hunters are particularly targeting. And we can see this again in those eastern Mediterranean sites, where humans are seemingly choosing to focus on gazelles and other smaller sized species because those types of prey are more available to them given their environment and their coexistence with hyenas. And along these points, the authors note that the apparent decline in megafaunal mass that Bitzer et al. Found, and this is shown again on the left, creates a bit of a false impression. So, three species of megafauna in particular are to blame for this: the straight tusked elephant, so Paleoloctodon antiquus, the aurochs, which is the now extinct species of cattle from which our domestic breeds originate, and the Mesopotamian fallow deer. Now, the loss of the biggest megafauna in this chart is solely accounted for by the elephants. So, if you took them out of the first step of that decline effectively vanishes.
Hmm.
And the aurochs and the fallow deer, while they do show declines in some cases, also show increases in body mass over time when you track them individually on this chart, which is interesting if we're supposed to be observing losses in game and not gains. So, in a sense, for these large periods of time, humans of different species, whether they be Neanderthals or Erectus, were hunting the same sized prey and not prey of increasingly smaller sizes. And most of the large species that actually became extinct, which is 10 out of the 83 that they sampled, died out during the earliest Paleolithic. And those kill sites from that time are technically still tenuous and contested at best. So we're still not sure whether we can actually blame human activities for those particular losses. Is it possible? Sure, but we don't have any good data, like really good data, to say whether it actually happened in that way. So we're at a bit of a serious loss for the Debitzer et al. Paper. So what do the response authors suggest in its place? While the original paper argued against the effect of rainfall or temperature changes in affecting megafaunal numbers, they did not account for larger scale climatic changes or faunal replacements as a result of migrations or population expansions. There is possible evidence to suggest that new corridors opened up outside the Levant, which allowed different species to colonize that part of the world, or even conspecifics of Levantine animals to essentially replenish the populations currently there. In one example of the former, both rhinos and hippos underwent faunal replacements in the Levant, with the living hippopotamus, so that's Hippopotamus amphibius, and an extinct rhino called Stephanorhinus, replaced earlier species until after 80,000 years ago. And of course, many other game species like gazelles, deer, and even the aurochs lasted, much longer than the time scale in the Dembitzer data set. So that appears to indicate a high level of resilience from human hunting,
Hmm.
especially since the aurochs is one of the largest animals recorded that is supposed to factor into this decline in megafauna over time. So it seems that instead of the losses in megafaunal species and numbers being solely due to some long-term hunting pressure by various human species, it's far more likely that the changes were facilitated by a number of different factors, including environmental ones. So, not just hunting pressures, but human prey choice and behavioral flexibility, as well as climatic changes that impacted animal distributions both within and without the Levant, which is certainly an argument for the Pleistocene extinctions that we have heard of before. Um, but at least it's a little bit more nuanced than the usual discourse might make it seem to be. And I know this is something that we have talked about with our friends, Albert. So I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Well, I see that the Pleistocene megafaunal extinction debate continues. um, it is a tricky subject to study for numerous reasons, and I I I think this response seems to raise some good points. Um, so I know. I mean, not being particularly familiar with this particular site, I look forward to further studies and interpretations. Um, but yeah, it does seem that it is very difficult to get very conclusive evidence one way or another. And I guess in some ways that's to be expected. That yeah, there probably were several factors at play, and it's like one of our friends, John said. The real question is whether humans were an important factor or not.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, well, I personally I tend to suspect that we probably were uh, an important factor, but at least in many cases of the Pleistocene extinctions. Uh, but yeah, like obviously that does not necessarily mean that humans individually killed like every single individual of every species that
Right.
that went extinct. It's possible that they put some other kind of pressure on them that made them more vulnerable to other changes, and that kind of stuck them in a feedback loop. And yeah, it it is still certainly a very highly contested issue, and I think this exchange certainly demonstrates that.
Right. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners have probably, been following my coverage of the megafaunal extinctions over the months and time. And yeah, I am more and more inclined to agree with you for sure. Um, what I'm definitely curious about, of course, and this is why this paper was so interesting to me, is whether Homo sapiens is kind of like the sole
Right.
human actor
Mm-hmm.
in those extinctions, or if there's some measurable trends we can find with other species. Because obviously, we've covered human evolution extensively on this series, and it's clear that by the time of like Homo ergaster and Homo erectus, there are um, behavioral and ecological capabilities of those species in hunting big game and leading large expeditions to hunt things like cattle or elephant relatives or things like that. Um, and so I am very curious to see whether they had the same sort of effect, or at least a similar sort of effect to what our species was probably doing towards the latter half of the Pleistocene. Because again, certainly, like in places like Africa, where the human story is mostly centered for over 7 million years or so, um, we are coexisting with a huge diversity of megafauna that seemingly was used to us, but was also being impacted by us to the point where you have these sorts of trends across geography where you look at the present day distribution of megafauna and you have places like Africa and southern Asia where we have a really good archaeological record for hominins, and it seems that the losses in megafauna numbers there were far less severe than if you look in places like Europe or Siberia, and then those are even less severe than in places like Australia or the Americas, where there is like no extensively long period of human interaction
Yep.
like there is in Africa or India. Um, so like I am curious of like if we're missing some details of that there. Um, if we get good records of African megafauna, we can see whether their resilience is not an artifact of the data, or if it's a lot more complex and nuanced than that seems to be. Um, but yeah, and of course, like there's also like my ongoing frustrations with the discourse to begin with. Um, I'm with a lot of my friends in that I am frustrated that people seem to avoid nuance in a lot of these things, where it has to be one way or the other way instead of like looking at the totality of the evidence, and seeing the complexity in these ecological systems that we're used to reading about,
Hmm.
um, regarding living wildlife, and then applying that back into prehistory. So yeah, definitely curious, definitely very curious. And I await the comments on this comment, where the original
Right.
authors are like, actually, no, your mama. We were right all along. Here's why. Because I have certainly seen papers like that
Oh yeah.
before, which is that's just the nature of the field for you. I guess there's a lot at stake.
Yeah.
Um, that's about it for um, this one. Albert, if you want to go into your May paper.
Sounds good. Yeah. So this is a paper about interesting animal behavior. I'm always kind of kind of stoked to see this kind of study. It's one of those relatively short papers that report something quite straightforward, but certainly makes the natural world ever more fascinating. And so this study is about buzzing noises made by these bats called greater mouse-eared bats. And so these bats, one of which is pictured on the slide here, they are actually one of the larger species of bat in Europe. But by that I mean like these are about the size of a house mouse. So like that qualifies as being relatively big for a European bat. And they mostly hunt for insects. Apparently, what they tend to do is not so much catch flying insects in the air as you might tend to imagine bats doing, but what they do is actually they will fly low over the ground and listen for the sound of insects or other arthropods walking around, and then they will kind of swoop down and grab them from the surface of the ground. So they have a pretty interesting kind of foraging style. And so the authors of the study decided to look at something a little different about their biology, because they noted that when these bats are being handled, they make a sort of call that sounds a lot like buzzing. And they wondered, I wonder if that buzzing is meant to mimic the sound of wasps and kind of maybe put off predators that way. Okay, well, that is an interesting hypothesis, so they decided to test that. And so they did this in a couple ways. First of all, they decided to run actual experiments with the potential predators of these bats. Namely, they looked at owls. So what they did was they played different sounds to various owls. So they played first of all, they played the sounds of a different kind of bat called the European free-tailed bat, and they played social calls of these free-tailed bats. So these are calls that would presumably not represent any sort of danger to these owls. And in fact, they might actually be interested in these kinds of sounds. Like, hey, I hear some bats over there. I might go over and have a take a shot at catching some. So they used the social calls of these free-tailed bats as a sort of a control group, and then they played various different types of buzzing sounds made by different types of animals. So they played buzzing sounds of bees, they played buzzing sounds of hornets, both of which are types of, of course, stinging insects, and technically both types of wasps. Bees are technically a type of wasp, phylogenetically speaking, and of course these buzzing sounds of the greater mouse-eared bats that they were curious about. And what they found was that owls, mostly experienced owls, which in this context means owls that have lived in the wild before as adults. So like these are owls that were not born in captivity or had been taken into captivity as juveniles, but had some experience living out in the wild and fending for themselves. they consistently moved away from buzzing noises, whether these were made by bees, hornets, or mouse-eared bats, but they tended to move towards social calls of free-tailed bats. So it seemed that they were actively trying to avoid buzzing sounds, but were interested in the sounds of European free-tailed bats, and or would try to approach them, in, perhaps in hopes of finding some prey. Um, so that was certainly consistent with their hypothesis that the greater mouse-eared bat buzzing calls were kind of evolved as a mimicry, or evolved as mimicry of the buzzing sounds of bees and hornets. Um, and furthermore, they also decided to do statistical analyses where they basically pulled together the different qualities of these different sounds, so such as the frequency and the volume and things like that. Like they took in all these different factors that influence how these sounds sound, and see if they could be statistically distinguished from each other. And it turns out that the buzzing sounds of these mouse-eared bats and of wasps could be statistically distinguished most of the time, but then the authors suggested, wait a minute, what we hear, or what their algorithm hears regarding these sounds, is not necessarily going to be how owls hear the sounds or other predators hear these sounds. And so they also reanalyzed these comparisons by kind of including only qualities that would be audible within the owl's hearing range. And it turns out that almost half the time, when you only include qualities within the owl's hearing range, these sounds would be misclassified. And especially, it was easy to confuse the sounds of these mouse-eared bats with the sounds of hornets specifically, not so much of bees, but specifically of hornets. And so it seems plausible that these buzzing sounds that greater mouse-eared bats make when they're disturbed are indeed kind of adapted to kind of mimic the buzzing sounds of hornets, and so in this way hopefully put off their predators. And so this is interesting for several reasons. And well, first of all, is the fact is that this is a thing in the first place, but also this is one of the very few examples of a mammal kind of using sound to mimic some other kind of animal. And so this is certainly noteworthy for that. And it also raises the possibility that what if there are some other animals out there that mimic the buzzing of wasps that we haven't really identified? The authors actually list several examples of other kinds of animals, like other kinds of birds and mammals. I should say other kinds of mammals and also some kinds of birds that make buzzing sounds when they are disturbed or handled or annoyed. What if these are also kind of meant to mimic the sounds of wasps that share their environment? That would take some study to figure out, but it seems like an interesting possibility that should be considered. Now, I have seen commentary in some news articles from other researchers who suggest that they're not completely convinced that this is an example of mimicry yet. That they would like to see even more evidence for it. However, I do think it opens up this possibility, and it does seem at least plausible that this is the case. And so, yeah, it certainly makes these species ever more interesting. Do you have any further thoughts about this?
Not much, but I love this paper. Like, that's such a neat idea. I'm not used to mammals mimicking insects.
Right, exactly.
Usually the other way around.
Yeah.
You have a moth with like eyes on its wings, or like caterpillars that look like bird doo-doo,
right,
or things like that. So I mean, if it is the case that this is like an example of mimicry, like that's a really, my gosh, I'm just trying to imagine like the evolution of a creature like this. Like you're just a normal bat flying around, and then it's like, oh, these owls keep eating us. It's like, oh wait, let's like mimic the sounds of stinging insects, and maybe they'll leave us alone. It seems to work out. That's amazing. I love it. I love this paper. And I'm definitely interested in finding out if this is a more widespread behavior. Um, yeah, like I want to go check out that list to see like what kind of species
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
if there's anything I can recognize. But that's cool. That's amazing. Oh, fantastic. All right. So we are now approaching June, and we have our last two papers. And yeah, we're gonna go back to the end Cretaceous extinction event
Yeah.
just for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, right. So my final story was one of those delightful science surprises that I was alluding to at the beginning of our episode. So one of the most important outcomes out of paleontological studies is understanding how life recovers from catastrophes. And considering we're currently experiencing quite a large environmental crisis, it helps to have the right kind of data to see what sorts of things we could expect under differing scenarios. And of course, the end Cretaceous extinction event 66 million years ago, which wiped out some 70% of all life, is probably one of the most famous and perhaps an outlier as far as mass extinction events go,
Mm-hmm.
considering that the causal agent of extinction was a bolide impact
Yep.
and not prolonged volcanic or tectonic activity, which seems to characterize the other mass extinction events.
Yep.
But that's still an ongoing debate, of course, as well as the fact that no major lineages of organisms seems to have died out, that time around. You have the Permian extinction where you have like whole lineages of arthropods that are just gone. But for the most part, a good chunk of organisms made it out of the Cretaceous extinction event, with the exception of like some reptiles and invertebrates, of course. But that's a whole other story. Um, we have been amassing a fair amount of data from that time about how long it took for living things to recover from the bolide impact. For example, in North America, we have evidence of a fern spike that occurred fairly soon after the impact. And you might recall from our update special to Humanity: A Prologue that the primate relative Purgatorius had diversified into two species with differing ecological niches within about 105 to 139,000 years of
Mm.
the impact. Given the models we have for the bolide, it appears that overall life on Earth took anywhere from tens to hundreds of thousands of years to fully recover and thus initiate the communities of the Paleocene epoch. But it is appearing that different ecosystems recovered at different times. In the current example for this, a June paper by Chase Duran Brownstein and Tyler R. Lyson, we have a new species of gar that was found in the deposits of the Williston Basin of North Dakota. Now, gars are long jawed, long bodied predatory fish that mostly inhabit freshwater rivers and lakes.
Mm-hmm.
And they belong to a lineage of bony ray finned fishes called Holostii, which they share with another long bodied predatory fish called the bowfin. And the group itself is fairly ancient. It shares a common ancestor with most of the other ray fin fishes, or the teleosts, around 250 million years ago. So they are certainly survivors. Now, this new gar species is called Atractosteus grandei. This is a relative of the living alligator gar, and its two relatives from Central America and the Caribbean. I have a photo of one of these below. Now, to the right is the fossilized skull of this new gar in different views.
Mm-hmm.
So, like you have the the top view above, we got the bottom view below, where you can see the lower jaw, and then kind of a side view on the bottom. And if you look at the in the corner at the right there,
Mm-hmm.
there's a size comparison of this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, that's because we have a near complete skeleton for this fish, and it stretches out to some 1.4 to 1.5 meters long.
Wow.
Now, that's not as big as some living alligator gars
Mm.
reach, but that is still very significant, especially for the age. And that brings us around to the main insight from this paper. Now, when I said that the fossils, now these fossils were found in early Paleocene rocks, and I mean that they were found in really early Paleocene rocks. So, Atractosteus grandei was found 18 centimeters above the KPG boundary. That's the layer of iridium that marks the end Cretaceous impact. So, this fish, which keep in mind is a large predatory freshwater species, was seemingly hunting and swimming only 1.5 to 2.5 thousand years
Mm.
after the massive bolide impact that ended the Mesozoic era. And associated fossils with this fish include a 1 meter long soft shelled turtle called Axostemes,
Mm.
as well as some fairly large salamanders. And there are lots of implications from this discovery. The authors suggest that there are at least two possibilities here. Um, Either the freshwater ecosystems in this part of North America managed to squeak through the entire extinction event relatively unharmed, or that the recovery of freshwater ecosystems was far more rapid in North America, at least, than was previously thought. Now, the latter seems especially intriguing, as current data samples from the KPG event point to lower levels of extinction in freshwater ecosystems
Yep.
than in marine ones. And as perhaps may be expected, land ecosystems seem to have taken a bit longer to recover than aquatic ones. So while Atractosteus grandei was alive, mammals still had a few hundreds of thousands of years to reach any significant sizes
Mm.
from prior to the impact. And forests were still depauperate. That is, the diversity was very low. And so there's also this effect called the Lilliput effect
Yep.
that this gar seems to have avoided. The Lilliput effect is when organisms undergo size changes in response to extinction events. Most often, it's when a species' body mass shrinks over time following catastrophes. And we don't see evidence of that effect on this fish. In fact, it's one of the largest freshwater vertebrates in North America at that time. And so part of the success of this gar in particular may come down to the peculiarities of gar physiology. So gars are able to breathe air,
Mm.
and so thus they can inhabit deoxygenated waterways, and they can swim in waters of different salinities. So any major changes in water quality could have been bypassed by the ancestors of this fish. And so, we're now having this emerging image of an apparently rapidly recovering and apparently very resilient freshwater ecosystem in North America, of all places, so close to the bolide impact, that features these large fishes and amphibians and reptiles existing so soon after one of the worst days in Earth's history.
Mm. Mm.
Um, so, yeah, this particular paper just grabbed my attention. I mean, yeah, 1,500 to 2,500 years after the impact, when some of the long-term effects for this were going to be going on for many thousands of years after that. It's just mind-boggling to
Mm-hmm.
me. What do you think, Albert?
Yeah, definitely. Like you said, it has long been suspected that freshwater ecosystems were less affected during the end Cretaceous mass extinction. And there are probably some pretty good reasons for that. Um, for example, the base of the food chain in freshwater ecosystems is not primarily dependent on, or at least not directly dependent on green vegetation. But instead on debris that is washed into the freshwater environment from the land. And so that's a source of food that perhaps would have been around for a while during the end Cretaceous mass extinction, even when green vegetation died out. And so it's very likely that that is something that helped a lot of these freshwater ecosystems survive and recover so quickly in the wake of the end Cretaceous mass extinction. But to find such a dramatic fossil like that, formed within just a few thousand years of the extinction event, that is incredible. Like, yeah, this is a pretty amazing animal and really really cool find. I definitely agree with all that you said there.
Absolutely, and I'm excited about that particular site, this
Mm-hmm.
this Williston Basin,
Yeah, yeah. Mm.
especially if they've previously found like other particularly large organisms that
Mm-hmm.
were coexisting with this. I'm curious to see if we have like crocodilians
Yeah.
or snakes, for example,
Hmm.
that or other types of freshwater fish, because of course North America kind of has a good namesake in freshwater fish species,
Ooh, yeah.
particularly old fish species like sturgeon.
Yep.
Um, so I'm very curious, like what we might be able to see in the near future. Um, so I just thought this was really neat, and I'm as much interested as I was much interested in the after effects of the KPG event as well as like what led up to it.
Hmm.
Because it's one thing to say, oh, a bolide hit the earth and everything went to shit, and then
Yeah.
things got better a little bit later.
Right.
But like, there's so much happening in between that period of
Yep.
time. So many small little important details that really kind of bring that more to life and kind of help understand like what made this bolide impact so dramatic to begin with.
Yep. Mm.
Um, I mean, really small things too, and like just the like the sheer like I guess what's the word I'm looking for? The uh, the sheer chance of the impact.
Hmm.
Because I remember reading this in several places. I don't know if this has been validated, but I think this is still accurate. That had the angle and like the location of impact of this bolide had been like slightly tweaked,
Ah, yeah. Mm.
yeah, like that whole event could have been bypassed
Essentially,
um,
yeah.
in pretty significant ways.
Right.
So like just that fact alone is like holy shit, like this is just the world is amazing. I'll just say that,
Yeah.
and
Indeed.
its history in particular is just a wild ride from start to finish.
Right.
That's why I love this stuff so much. But yeah, I guess with that, we can move on to your June
Yep.
and our last study
Yes,
for
indeed.
today.
Sure thing. So, this study is about turtles, which is interesting because apparently, as far as I can remember, I don't think we've covered a story about turtles before.
Uh, I can't say that we have. That's a nice landmark for our show.
Interesting, yeah, because that is surprising because turtles are absolutely fascinating animals, and um, they are probably one of the most bizarre vertebrates that are around today. Paleontologists like to joke that if turtles were extinct, people would be flocking to museums to see their remains, much like we do with Mesozoic dinosaurs and pterosaurs, because they are so odd. And they're odd in many ways, but I mean, just as one of my kind of go-to facts about them, consider the fact that a turtle's shoulder blade is inside its rib cage. Like absolutely no other animal has that. Like anything that has a shoulder blade that is not a turtle has it attached to the outside of its rib cage, which is, you think that is a normal thing to do. And of course, you can check that for yourself. Check, feel where your own shoulder blade is. It's certainly attached to the outside of our rib cage. But in turtles, during the evolution of the shell and during also a developmental, the developmental process as an embryo, the the entire forelimb girdle basically kind of slips underneath, or rather, the ribs kind of go over the 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 shoulder blade and enclose it inside this box. And so, yeah, turtles are always like carrying their own box with them and living inside it, and it is that shell is part of their skeleton. So contrary to various cartoons, they cannot leave the shell. They can't get out of it, not without killing themselves. But yeah, like their anatomy is just so bizarre, and furthermore, the kind of the evolution and relationships of turtles to other animals, other vertebrates in particular, has been one of the most controversial subjects in vertebrate evolutionary biology for a long time, and to an extent, it still is controversial. Yeah, but I guess I don't think we really have time to go into that at the moment. So maybe at some point in the future we can talk about turtle evolution. It's a fascinating story, but this this study is about something different, but also another very fascinating aspect of their biology, because something else turtles are very well known for is the fact that they tend to be very long-lived. Yeah, they like some species, like the Aldabra giant tortoise pictured here, they can live well over 100 years, perhaps even 200 years. And it is actually very difficult to confirm how old some of these very old tortoises are, because they tend to outlive the people who are observing them. And so it's like hard to get a good handle on exactly how old they are when you die in the middle of keeping your records. But yeah, and not all turtles live that long, but many of them can live for a pretty respectable amount of time, like several decades at least. And so they are certainly very well known for longevity. But there haven't been many studies looking at how turtles really age, I guess. It's just like they can live a long time, but like well, what's their aging process like? That's not something that has been studied very much. And so this study decided to take a look at that. And what they did was they looked at records of the age and survival of captive turtles that are held in zoos, and they basically look at these records to see, okay, so how long do these individuals of these particular species live in captivity? And so they pulled together this huge data set of all these different turtle species that are held in zoos and of how long they live under these captive conditions. And, well, they found something quite interesting. Well, first of all, they found that 80% of the species they looked at aged slower than humans. And so, well, what does this mean? Well, what they did was they looked at senescence in turtles. So, essentially, how does age correlate with the chances of these turtles passing away? So, as you might expect, in humans, the rate of death goes, vastly higher as you age, unfortunately. As you age, you get more prone to diseases and accidents, and you're essentially more likely to die the older you get. And whereas in turtles, it seems that in most species, this kind of drop-off does not happen nearly so rapidly as they age, as it does in humans. And not only that, in a few species, they found that the mortality rate, the rate of death, did not correlate with age at all. And so that means that these particular types of turtles, including the Aldabra giant tortoise, may have what is called negligible senescence, or negligible senescence. And this has been documented in a few other kinds of animals. Some types of fishes have it, for example. There was one study that suggested naked mole rats have it, which is interesting. Naked mole rats are another species that's just so incredibly weird. But yeah, no, this story is not about them. But essentially what this means is that the rate of death does not go down as they age. Like a turtle of these species, at least, is about equally likely to die, whether it is 100 years old or, I don't know, say 50 years old or 30 years old. The rate of death does not really increase as they age. And sometimes negligible senescence has been called biological immortality. So people sometimes say, okay, animals that have negligible senescence are immortal, quote unquote. And yeah, it is kind of fun to think of them in that way. Like, yeah, in a sense, they don't, their chances of dying do not increase with age. So they are sort of immortal in that their body does not really deteriorate at a rate that we are used to when we think of aging. But this doesn't mean that they're literally like immortal. Like, of course, they can still die from accidents and such. And more importantly, this doesn't necessarily mean that they could theoretically live forever, like if nothing happened to them, because the fact is that they still do have a mortality rate across all their ages, right? So eventually they're going to get to a point where they're gonna die of something. Like it's not like the mortality rate for any of these species with negligible senescence is zero. It's still there. It's just like potentially very low, but it actually doesn't have to be. Like in some species, the mortality rate might be very high, but the the key is that it does not become higher over time as they age. But in any case, yeah, they still do have immortality rates, meaning that eventually something or another is going to get them. But even so, I think negligible senescence is something that um, humans are pretty interested in. Like, is it possible to live, forever, at least to extend our lifespans for a considerable amount? And figuring out how these animals do it could potentially help us in that endeavor. Um, Something else they noticed, looking at records of turtles in the wild, is that some species of turtles apparently age faster in the wild than in captivity. And to an extent, that might be expected. In the wild, you're not being cared for 24/7. Food resources are unpredictable. There are a lot more predators. Yeah, it's a lot more stressful living out in the wild in many cases. Um, but even though this pattern might be expected, it is still interesting because this is something that doesn't happen with humans. Uh, so the thing is, even though human life expectancy has increased, over time across history, the main reason for this is not because our rate of aging has slowed down because we're being taken, better care of, with healthcare and good resources of food and nutritious food in many cases. It's not because of the quality of living is higher. It's not really the quality of living is higher, but it's not really slowing our rate of aging down. The main reason that the average lifespan has increased is more because the rates of death in childhood have decreased. So more children are surviving nowadays compared to previous times in history when it comes to humans, and that's the main reason that overall lifespans are becoming higher over time. But even so, the actual rate of aging, the actual rate of senescence in humans has still remained roughly the same over time, which is very different in turtles, where it turns out that if you take care of a turtle very well, if you give it high quality care, it seems that many of these species can actually slow down their rate of aging in response to this. And so that is certainly something we would be very interested in seeing if we could harness for ourselves, probably. And so this study doesn't really look at the mechanisms for how turtles are able to slow down their aging rate in favorable circumstances, or really how they're able to live lives where their mortality rate doesn't increase in the first place. But it is a very good start and a very impressive data set that they gathered together. A very good start in understanding in confirming that, yeah, turtles can live a long time because they have this either slow or negligible senescence, like many other long-lived animals do. And so certainly looking to turtles, we might be able to unlock more secrets of longevity. And I might as well mention here, even though I didn't pick it as my story, in the same issue of science journal called Science that this paper came out in, there was a second study as well that looked at not just turtles but also the aging rates across all kinds of amphibians and non-bird reptiles, and it found that in many of these species slow aging rates are actually the norm. So many of these, like quote-unquote cold-blooded vertebrates seem to share these slow aging rates, and they were also able to look at certain factors that influence this. And one of the things they found was that species that are better protected in some way, like species with armor or species that are poisonous, are more likely to have these slower aging rates, which makes sense, and it fits in with some previous hypotheses about how animal longevity evolves. It's like if you have that protection in the first place, that means that natural selection can has a better chance of acting on ways to increase your lifespan, because if you don't have that protection, well, you might as well die early anyways, right? Like the chances of you dying early are much higher, so there is less of a chance for you to survive to a point where natural selection can say, okay, you're less likely to get cancer in your old age or something like that.
Mm.
And so it certainly fits in with the turtles being able to live for very long, because they of course have this very handy defense, the shell that they carry with them all the time. And so it's quite likely that they are able to avoid a lot of injury by having this adaptation, and thus are in a good position to evolve long lifespans and negligible senescence. And so, yeah, always cool to learn new things about turtles. Do you have anything to add to this?
Not particularly, but I mean, I definitely agree that turtles are certainly some very amazing animals, and yeah, like their age is certainly like one of their main claims to fame. It's funny, like I'm thinking back to there's like a famous story. Y'all have probably seen it somewhere on the internet somewhere, but like there was a Galapagos tortoise that I guess was collected by Charles Darwin
Mm-hmm.
during the Beagle voyage, um, and somehow it ended up in the zoo, and it outlived Charles Darwin,
Yeah.
and it had only died relatively recently,
Yeah.
like I think in the early 2000s,
Right.
but it had lived apparently to be like over 170 years old.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean that's just, I mean like long-lived animals and plants
Yeah.
are one of those subjects that always just blows my mind every time I read
Right.
about them. I mean, think about like certain types of trees that clone themselves and they form these huge colonies, and some of these may be like in existence since the last ice age.
Right. Yeah.
Um, it is just incredible. I mean, if plants could talk, my goodness, what stories could they tell us about their experiences? Um, and so that's very interesting. Um, that turtles kind of slow down their aging in captivity. Yeah, I'd be very much interested to see that research somehow applied to humans in a way, especially since aging in us is always well, for lack of a better word, it's always a pain in the ass,
Right.
and and there's just so much at stake
Yeah.
as we age. I mean, I see that with my parents as well.
Mm-hmm.
Not to get too personal, but I mean, when you're a kid and you're with your parents, they seem invincible, right? And then as you age, and if you happen to have a good relationship with them and you spend more time with them,
Yeah.
and you see them age in real time
Yeah.
to where it's harder to do things than they could when they were younger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that gets to you.
Yeah.
It's an emotional thing for sure. Um, so like I am certainly on the team of anything we can do to make the aging process smoother,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even last a little bit longer too.
Yeah.
So definitely looking forward to seeing this research applied further on, and with other organisms as well.
Oh.
Yeah, because like reptiles and amphibians, well, the non-bird reptiles and amphibians, they seem to be the champions of just growing like extensively and living very long too.
Mm.
Um, that's always been interesting to me as well. Um, it's like I always hear reports about like long-lived snakes or long-lived crocodiles that are
Yeah.
just enormous now
Yeah.
compared to like the typical members of their species, and um, it kind of it's neat. It's neat to see for sure. Um, well, alrighty then. Well, if there's anything else you have to add, Albert, I do believe we are at the end of our show.
Yes, indeed.
Um, I'll tell you what, it's been good. It's good to be back for sure. And if you're just tuning in, or if you've been tuning in with us for a while, um, and you like what we do, perhaps you can consider supporting us on Patreon. We have opened that up. And of course, your contributions would help us continue the series and develop new projects and expansions. Uh, Monetary donations of any size are more than welcome, and we are very fortunate to have about 4 Patreons currently, and all of them are at a tier where they are given shout outs. So we want to give our special thanks to my sister Julie and our good friends Alari and Denver, as well as our other contributor Paul, who has provided us with some very fascinating information over the years and asks really great questions.
Hmm.
And we really appreciate all of y'all's help and support. Of course, we also like to give our general acknowledgments. We'd like to thank our good friends Henry and Alicia to their contributions to this series. Henry is, of course, behind the wonderful theme music that opens up every episode of our show,
Yep.
and Alicia is responsible for the color scheme of Albert's Alvarezor Avatar. And of course, I guess also another big acknowledgement to Jamie Kanipa for allowing us to reproduce his Isopod Evolution comic,
Yep.
which is very wonderful. We wish them all the best. And of course, if you wish to keep up with us, we are on Twitter. You can follow us for updates at Time and Clades, where we generally put announcements as well as like we upload new episodes. But most likely you're watching us on YouTube, so you can go to our page through Time and Clades, and if you like, you can give us a subscription where you will get instant access to the latest episodes when they arrive. And if you have any questions about the material covered in this episode or any other episode, or just in general, then we happily accept those. You can comment on our YouTube, you can send them on Twitter, or you can shoot us an email, timeandclades@gmail.com. And of course, all the papers we've discussed and other links mentioned will be put in the description below, so you can go and read the papers for yourselves and learn a little bit more about the subjects covered on our episodes. And with that, that is the end. We are certainly hoping to continue our regular updates from before, so you will most likely see a July news episode uh, towards the end of the month or after the month has passed. Um, let's see. I know I had promised you all a review episode for a academic book.
Mm.
That's going to be put on hold for the time being, but that is still on the table. But otherwise, we do not have any major plans for new episodes up and coming. I do know that the update special for Humanity Prologue is it's reaching about that time where it's to be considered.
Hmm.
So I may be working on that myself next. Because goodness knows if you've been following anthropology news, we've had some really fun papers that have been coming up, and in a field that is always and ever changing. So I definitely would look forward to sharing a lot of those with you all and explaining them to everyone as well.
Excellent.
But with that, that's it. We want to thank you all very much for joining in, and we will see you next time.
Yep. See you soon, hopefully. Take care.